Hello students. Today we will study about an occupation that has been prominent since ages, that is, agriculture. An occupation that provided job opportunity to many and provided food and resources to nations. Let's have a look at this noble profession in aspect of England. Swink Rioters. With emergence of industrialization, man was introduced to the art of mass production and usage of machines for his aid. While at one end the machines eased his work and made it faster and more efficient, it also decreased the requirement of laborers, which agitated the poor, daily wagers class. Between 1930 and 1932, many farmers in England were attacked by rioters. These rioters destroyed threshing machines, burnt barns and haystack, and sometimes burnt the entire farmhouse. Farmers used to receive threatening letters, which were signed by Captain Swink, a mythical name, and thus rioters came to be known as Swink Rioters. The letters urged the farmers to stop using the new machines since the new machines deprived poor peasants out of job. The government took stern action to control this destruction, and people were rounded up on suspicion. 1,976 prisoners were tried, 9 men were hanged, 505 men were transported, and 644 were put in jails. The time of open fields and enclosures. Before the late 18th century, large parts of English countryside were open. There was no partition of land to mark the ownership. Peasants cultivated on strips of land around the village. At the beginning of each year, each villager was allotted a number of strips to cultivate, for which the decision was taken at a public meeting. Usually a farmer was given strips of varying quality to ensure equitable distribution of good and bad land to all farmers. The land beyond these strips was called the common land. All villagers had access to the commons, which were used as pasture and for collecting firewood and fruits. Rivers and ponds were used by all for fishing, and the common forests were used for rabbit hunting. It was known that the common land was essential for the survival of poor in case of crop failure. We all know certain vices lay their traps in an elaborate net. Greed became a predator on minds of people after some time, and they no longer were content in their mutual partnerships. Things took a turn for bad around the 16th century when the price of wool went up in the world. The rich farmers wanted to expand wool production in order to earn more profits. To improve their sheep's breeds and its feed, they started taking control of large areas of land in compact blocks. They began dividing and enclosing common land and started building hedges around land to demarcate their property. The poor peasants were driven out from these enclosed fields. This movement proceeded very slowly till the mid of the 18th century. But after the mid-18th century, it got momentum. Between 1750 and 1850, about 6 million acres of land was enclosed, and the British Parliament passed 4,000 acts to legalize these enclosures. The enclosures which were made in the 16th century were meant for sheep farming, but those made in the late 18th century were for grain production. The English population increased rapidly from the mid-18th century. This was also the time when Britain was industrializing. Since more and more people began to migrate to the urban areas, the demand for food grain increased, and so did the prices. At the end of the 18th century, England was at war with France. Since war disrupted trade and import of food grains from Europe, price rise of food grain in England was more evident. As it generally happens, the higher prices encouraged the landowners to enlarge their enclosures for grain cultivation, and the pressure on the Parliament to pass the Enclosure Acts intensified. The Age of Enclosures. Before 1780s, rapid population growth was usually followed by a period of food shortages in England, but after that, the food production matched with population growth. In 1868, England was producing about 80% of the food it consumed, and the rest was imported. This rise in production was no magic. Instead, it was the result of increase in cultivable land, which was originated by conversion of pasture lands, open fields, forest commons, marshes, etc. It was during this time only that farmers realized the benefit of nitrogen-producing crops like turnip and clover, which helped in restoring soil fertility by replenishing the nitrogen in soil. Enclosures were now seen as important for making long-term investments on land and for planning crop rotations to improve the soil and produce more for the market. What happened to the poor? As the expansion of enclosures took place, the poor no longer had access to the common land. They were unable to collect firewood, apples, hunt small animals, or graze their cattle. Most of the poor from the Midlands were forced to move to southern countries to earn livelihood. Since the southern part was most intensely cultivated, there was a great demand for agricultural labourers. By 1800, labourers were being paid wages and employed only during harvest season, and their wages was reduced to increase more profit. Thus, poor suffered from job insecurity and instability. The introduction of threshing machines. During the Napoleonic Wars, prices of food grains were high, and farmers vigorously expanded production to grab the opportunity. This was the time new threshing machines had come into the market. The farmers began buying those machines as they feared a shortage in labor. Once the war ended, thousands of soldiers returned to the villages. This was also the time when grain from Europe began coming into England. Since supply increased, the prices declined and thus set in great agriculture depression. The landowners reduced the cultivated area and demanded a ban on imports and tried to cut the workforce and wages. The unemployed poor moved from village to village in search of job. This was a situation which gave rise to the Swink Rioters.